hidden in the cellar since she was 7. A Lakota chief opened the door and let her see sky. The padlock was rusted all the way through. I noticed it before I noticed anything else, before the broken window, before the smoke smell still coming off the walls, before the body of Herschel Grubb laid out stiff in the yard with the ravens already on him. I noticed the padlock because I'd been a man who paid attention to locks his whole life. On a powder box, on a treaty chest, on the door of the Indian agent's office that they never left open unless they wanted you to think something was yours to walk through. This padlock was on a cellar door, flush with the ground at the side of the house, and it was the kind of rusted you get when something's been locked a long time and the key's been gone longer than that. My name is Lakota Whitehorse. That is the name my mother gave me, and the name the whites wrote in their ledgers, though they usually dropped the first part and just called me White when they had to call me anything civil. I was 51 years old that autumn. A chief. Though what that word meant had been carved down so many times, by then it fit in the palm of your hand. I had 230 of my people on a reservation in the Dakotas that was half the size of the one we'd started with, and the buffalo had been gone since I was a young man, and the winters did not care about any of that. I was off the reservation because 3 young men from my band had not come back from a trading run to the settlement called Harrow Fork, and the agent, a man named Collier who wore the same brown coat every day and smelled of old coffee, had told me he'd seen nothing, knew nothing, and suggested I wait. I had waited 4 days. That was enough waiting. I found my young men in the jail at Harrow Fork, locked up on a charge of stealing that the sheriff named Pickett had not bothered to write down anywhere. I had a conversation with Sheriff Pickett. It was a short conversation. He released my men, and I told them to go straight back and I would follow. I was following when I came up the creek road that ran past the Grubb homestead. I'd known Herschel Grubb for years the way you know a man you'd rather not know, because he was there, and because ignoring a man entirely costs more energy than a nod. He was not a good man. He had a mouth that only opened to take something in or push something ugly out. His wife had died 11 years back. I'd heard that from a woman at the trading post, and after that he'd lived alone on that dried-up 40 acres and bothered whichever of my people came within bothering distance. The ravens told me something was wrong before I could see the body. They have a different sound for a man-sized thing. I'd known that since I was a boy. I came around the front of the house and saw Grubb laid out in the dirt, face up, arms at his sides like he'd been set there rather than fallen. No blood I could see from where I sat my horse. Heart, maybe. He wasn't a young man, and he'd had the look of a man whose heart was running on spite these last years. I sat the horse for a moment and looked at the house. Then I heard the sound from under the ground. Not a sound like an animal, not a scrape or a scratching. It was the sound a human body makes when it shifts its weight from one foot to the other on a wooden floor, a small creak, deliberate. The way you'd move if you'd learned very early that moving made things worse, so you moved only when you had to, and when you did you tried to make no sound, and you almost never could. I got down from the horse. The padlock was iron and it was old, and the hasp it sat in had started to pull away from the wood. I had a short-handled hatchet in my belt. I carried it because it was useful, and it took 3 strikes to break the hasp away. The door was heavy. It had been weighted. He'd put something on top of it, a half-filled feed sack, and it took me a moment to shove that off before I could pull the doors open. The smell that came up was the worst thing I had smelled in a long time, and I had smelled things. Dark and close, and the particular sharp smell of human fear that's been locked in a small space, so long it became the air. There was no light down there, none at all. I stood at the top of the ladder and waited, let my shadow fall in, let whoever was down there know the shape of me. I did not call out. I had learned not to startle trapped things. After a moment, I heard breathing. I said in English very quietly, "The man who kept this lock is dead. You can come out." Silence. "I am not going to pull you out. I am going to stand back. I stepped back 2 paces from the door, put my hands where they would be visible if I did not know it was a she, not yet, if whoever was down there looked up. It took a long time, long enough that the horse wandered to the creek and drank, long enough that the ravens finished with grub and moved off into the cottonwoods. Then there were hands on the ladder, small hands, pale with dark under the nails, gripping the wood rung. Then a head coming up slowly, blinking, and the blinking was not the ordinary blinking of a person coming into light. It was the blinking of someone for whom light was not a daily thing. Each blink careful, testing, like she was waiting for it to hurt more than it did. She came up the last rung and stood in the yard. I put her at maybe 20, maybe a year or 2 either side. It was hard to be sure because she had the look of a person whose body had been given very little to work with. Thin, in a way that was not the thinness of a lean season but of years. Hair that had probably been light brown at some point, tangled past any brushing. Dressed in what had been a shift once and was now more idea than cloth. She stood with her shoulders curved inward, which I recognized as a habit of making yourself smaller so there was less of you to reach, and she kept her eyes down. Then she looked up, just for a second, green eyes and in them something that had not quite gone out yet. I had seen that look in animals caught in traps, the place behind the pain where the animal is still entirely itself, waiting. It costs something to see that in a person. I said, "Do you know where you are?" She said, "Grub's place." Her voice was hoarse in a way that told me she hadn't used it much. The words were careful, like she was retrieving them from somewhere. I said, "Before that, do you know where you were before this place?" She looked at the sky, not at me, at the sky. She tipped her head back and looked at it, and I watched her throat move. She said, "I don't think so." I didn't ask more right then. I had 3 options as I stood in that yard. I could ride to Harrow Fork and tell Sheriff Pickett, which would mean putting her in front of a man who just had 4 of my people in his jail for no crime, and who had the ethical composition of a mud fence. I could ride to the next county where there was said to be a mission, which would take the better part of 2 days, or I could take her back to my people. I am not going to pretend I didn't think through all 3. I thought through all 3. The second option, if she were riding, would be 1 day, but she was not in riding condition. She needed to eat. She needed water. She needed to sit down somewhere that was not underground. I went inside the grub house. It took my eyes a moment. A man's place, and not a man who'd ever had anything to take care of the mess of years of living alone and not caring. I found a water pail and filled it at the well. I found half a pan of cold cornbread on the back of the stove and a tin of salt pork. I found a wool blanket that was worn at the edges but whole, and I took that. When I came back out, she had moved about 3 feet from the cellar door. She was standing with her arms at her sides and her face still up at the sky. She had not moved when I went into the house. She was just looking at sky. I set the water pail down where she could reach it. She looked at it. Then she drank, slowly, carefully, both hands around the bucket, and I noticed she did not gulp. She drank the way you drink when you've learned that drinking too fast makes you sick, so you hold yourself back even when everything in you wants to pour it in. I set the cornbread and the salt pork on the ground near the bucket and walked away to give her room. She ate. She ate slowly, and she ate it all. Then she sat down in the dirt, right where she was, with the blanket I'd handed her wrapped around her shoulders, and she looked at me. She said, "You're Lakota." I said, "Yes." She said, "He told me the Lakota would skin me alive if they found me." I thought about Herschel Grubb laid out in the yard. I thought about what I would have liked to say to him before he was in no condition to hear it. I said, "He lied to you about a number of things, I expect." Something moved across her face. Not quite a smile, the shape a smile would have left if she'd had practice. She said her name was Clara Marsh. She said she'd been brought to the grub place when she was 7 years old. That was the last thing she said for a while, and I didn't press. 7 to 20 was 13 years. 13 years of that padlock and that cellar and Herschel Grubb's idea of what was owed to him. I am not going to speak all of it here. I learned it in pieces over the weeks that followed, the way you learn the whole shape of a thing only after you've been walking around it long enough. What I will say is that her parents had died of fever on the trail west, and she'd been taken in by a cousin of her father's who'd sold her to Grubb for the price of a debt. She'd been 7. She remembered a yellow dress. She remembered her mother's hand, the particular way her mother's hand smelled of soap and pine. She remembered those two things and not much else from before, which I thought was both the cruelest and the most merciful thing about the whole situation. She had lived in that cellar. Not always. He'd let her out to work the kitchen and the garden in daylight, when there was no one around to see. But she'd slept down there, every night, 13 years of it. I told her I was taking her north with me. I said it plain, the way I said things that were not open for debate, not rough, just settled. I said I did not know yet what the right next step was for her, but that what was under that ground was finished, and I was not leaving her in a dead man's yard. She looked at me a long time. She said, "All right." We did not make it far that first day. She could walk, but her legs were unsteady, not from injury, but from a lifetime of a space too small to build real stride in. We camped by the creek, and I put the horse between her and the open ground so she'd feel less exposed, and she slept in the blanket with her back against a cottonwood and her face pointed east. When I checked on her before first light, she was already awake, just watching the darkness thin, like she was making sure it was real. I said, "It'll be lighter in an hour." She said, "I know, I just want to watch it happen." I understood that. We reached my camp on the 4th day. I should say what my camp was because it mattered. It was not the main settlement. I had left a small working camp about a day's ride out, 3 families and some younger men I'd brought to help with the late fall cutting and drying. My sister Winona was there, and her daughter, and 2 older women I'd known since boyhood. I had thought about what to say before I arrived. I had thought about it most of those 4 days. What I said to Winona first was the truth. I said I had found a woman in a cellar. I said she had been put there as a child and had been kept there, and that the man who'd kept her was dead now and she had no one. I said I had brought her here because here was the first safe place I could think of. Winona looked past me at Clara, who was sitting on the ground with her arms around her knees, watching the camp the way she watched everything, carefully, ready to be wrong about it being safe. Winona said, "In Lakota, she looks like something the creek left behind." I said, "Also in Lakota, she is stronger than she looks." Winona said, "They always are." She walked over to Clara and said in passable English, "Come and eat." Clara looked at me. I nodded. She got up and followed Winona. I stood there for a moment by myself. The sun was going behind the ridge, and the cold that comes after the sun in late October hit the back of my neck, and I thought, you don't know what you've done. Not yet. You've brought this woman into your people's space when your people have barely enough room for themselves, when the agent is watching every move you make, when 3 of your young men were just in a white sheriff's jail for no reason. You've done something that will require explaining, and explaining it will cost something, and you made the decision alone. I thought all of that. And then I thought about a padlock rusted all the way through, and a set of small hands gripping a ladder rung, and green eyes looking up at sky for what might have been the first time in years. I didn't regret it. That was the part that surprised me. Winona and the older women, whose names were Magpie and Stand Still in Water, took Clara in hand without being asked to. That was the thing about those women. They had a kind of practical compassion that did not announce itself. They did not ask Clara's story all at once. They gave her food, and they let her sit near the fire, and one of them, Magpie, who had hands like 2 good tools, started working on Clara's hair without speaking, just gradually, starting at the ends, and Clara sat still for it with her eyes half closed, and I thought, that woman has not been touched kindly in 13 years, and she is trying to hold very still so the kindness doesn't startle and run. I watched from a distance. I was aware that I was watching, and I told myself I was keeping an eye on the situation, making sure she was all right. That was partly true. The other part was that she was a person I found myself wanting to understand, and I didn't have a good account of why. She learned our names fast. She was quiet but not passive. She asked questions when she had them, short questions with her eyes already measuring the answer before it came. She watched how things were done, and then she did them without being told. The third day she was with us, she was helping with the drying racks, cutting the meat the way Winona showed her, slower at first and then with more confidence, and Winona said something to her that I didn't catch, and Clara laughed. I had not heard her laugh before. It was a short sound, surprised at itself. I was across the camp, and I heard it, and I stopped what I was doing. The trouble came in the second week. It came in the form of a man named Dunnett, who rode in from Harrow Fork claiming to be the county land commissioner and looking for the Grubb property. He had a young man with him who wrote things down in a book. Dunnett was the type who wore his authority in his chest, always a half-breath from full expansion, always just about to explain why he outranked you. He had pale eyes and a way of looking at you that was designed to make you feel like a guest in your own life. He did not speak to me directly at first. He spoke past me to the young man with the book, noting things, noting the number of people, noting the horses, noting the fire. I let him note for a while. Then I stepped in front of him and I said, "What do you want from my camp, Commissioner?" He looked at me, that expanding chest look. He said he was conducting an inventory of the Grubb property, and he paused here, its contents, following Herschel Grubb's death. He said there was the matter of a dependent. I said, "There is no dependent here." He said, "There is a woman reported to have been on that property, a white girl." I said, "She is not property." He said he was not suggesting she was property. He was suggesting she was a ward of the state, and the state had an interest in her whereabouts and welfare. I said, "And you think the state's interest in her welfare is better served than mine has been?" He looked at me with those pale eyes. I said she was in a cellar for 13 years. The state did not find her, I did. The young man with the book had stopped writing. Dunnett said, "Chief Whitehorse." I said, "She is here, she is safe. She is free to speak for herself. If you wish to speak with her, you may ask her. If she wishes to speak with you, she will. That is the arrangement." He did not like it. He was a man who was used to arrangements having his name on them. But I had 20-some people in this camp, and he had one young man with a book, and the calculation was not hard. He agreed stiffly. I went and found Clara, who had been watching the whole exchange from next to the drying racks. I told her what he wanted. I told her she didn't have to speak with him if she didn't want to. I told her that whatever she decided, I would stand by it. She looked at Dunnett from across the camp. She looked at him for a good while. She said, "What would happen if I went with him?" I said I didn't know exactly. A county home, probably. Maybe a mission. Maybe someone decided she was of an age to be put into service somewhere. She said, "And if I stay here?" I said, "That is between you and whatever that man decides to do about it." She said, "What do you want, Lakota?" It was the first time she'd used my name, not Chief, not the Lakota man, my name. I looked at her, at those green eyes that had watched the sky every morning for the 10 days she'd been with us, like she was still making sure it was there. I said, "I want you to be somewhere no one can put you underground again." She nodded once, the way she nodded when she'd made a decision and it was settled. She walked across the camp to Dunnett, and I walked 2 paces behind her, and she stood in front of him and she said, in a clear voice, a voice that had gotten some of its use back in 10 days of talking to people who answered her, she said, "My name is Clara Marsh. I am not a ward of anyone. I am here by my own choice and I am choosing to stay. Dunnett said, Miss Marsh, you understand. She said, I have been underground since I was 7 years old, Commissioner. I understand a great deal. I understand that no one from this county came to find me, and that this man, she didn't turn to look at me, she kept her eyes on Dunnett. This man is the one who opened the door. I am going to stay where the door was opened. Dunnett looked at me. I looked back at him. He left. The young man with the book looked at Clara for a moment before he mounted up. He had the look of someone who had just seen something that would stay with him. He nodded to her once, and she gave him a short nod back, and then he was gone. After they rode out, I stood where I was for a moment. I was aware of a feeling in my chest that was not entirely comfortable, because I did not know its full name. It was something like being anchored to a place you had not expected to call yours. Clara came to stand beside me. She was looking out after the dust the horses left. She said, will he come back? I said, probably. She said, with more men. I said, possibly. She said, will you still be here when he does? I said, yes. She turned and looked at me, and for the first time since I'd found her, she looked at me the way you look at a person you're actually seeing, not assessing threat, not measuring distance, but actually seeing. Her jaw was set and her eyes were steady, and she looked at me the way the women of my mother's generation looked at men they trusted, like a verdict that had been carefully considered. She said, all right then. She went back to the drying racks. I stood there for another moment. Winona appeared at my elbow, the way she always appeared when she'd been watching something she felt I needed perspective on, and she said, in Lakota, you know you're going to have to figure out what this is. I said, I know. She said, she's not a stray dog. I said, I know that too. Winona made a sound that was not quite a laugh and was not quite agreement and went back to her fire. Dunnett did come back. He came back in November, early November when the cold was starting to mean it, and he brought Sheriff Pickett with him and 2 deputies, and a letter from the district court that said, in the particular language of men who enjoy the sound of authority, that the court had taken an interest in the disposition of one Clara Marsh, formerly dependent of the late Herschel Grubb, and that she was to be brought before the court at her earliest convenience. Her earliest convenience. I had read enough of their letters to understand that meant now. I read the letter. I read it twice. I handed it back to Dunnett and I said, she is free to appear before any court she chooses. Pickett said, Chief Whitehorse, we have a court order. I said, you have a letter. The court order references her as a dependent of Herschel Grubb. Grubb is dead. The dependency is therefore ended. She is an adult woman of her own legal standing. You are welcome to speak with her. Pickett did not like this. Pickett did not like most things that required him to think. He said, she's living on an Indian camp. I said, she is living where she chooses to live. He said, we have reason to believe she's being held against her will. I said, by whom did you receive that reason? He didn't answer. I said, because I would like to know whose description of this woman's will you found more convincing than her own statement of it, given to Commissioner Dunnett 3 weeks ago in the presence of a witness. The young man with the book who was back looked down at his book. Pickett looked at Dunnett. I said, I will go and get her. She will speak with you. She will tell you again what she told you before. And when she has done that, you will take your court order and your letter and your reasons and you will go back to Harrow Fork. I went and got Clara. She was inside Winona's lodge and she knew what was happening. She'd heard the horses and she'd watched from the doorway. She looked at me when I came in, not frightened, just clear-eyed and measuring. She said, how many? I said 4. She said, Pickett. I said, yes. She stood up. She smoothed her skirt. She had been given clothing by Winona's daughter, and she wore it plainly, without self-consciousness. She looked at the ground for a moment and then she looked up at me. She said, "What do they actually want?" I said, "I think Dunnett wants the grub land settled and the loose end of you tied off so there's no complications in the title. I think Pickett wants a reason to take something from me." She said, "Do they know about each other's reasons?" I said, "Men like that rarely do." Something moved across her face. The thing that sometimes happened that was almost a smile. She said, "What do I say?" I said, "Say what you said before. Say it the same way." She said, "And if they try to take me anyway?" I said, "They won't." She said, "How do you know?" I said, "Because I'll be standing next to you." She looked at me a long time, not with fear, not with gratitude exactly, with something more level than either of those, a kind of recognition. She said, "Do you know what you remind me of?" I said, "No." She said, "The door, when you opened it, I didn't trust you at first, I didn't trust anything, but you opened the door and stood back and waited. You didn't reach in, you didn't demand, you just opened it and stood back." She paused. She said, "I don't think I've ever had anyone just open a door and stand back before." I didn't know what to do with that. I knew it was true and I knew it mattered, and I knew I was not a man who was practiced at this particular kind of conversation. I said, after a moment, "Are you ready?" She said, "Yes." We walked out together. She stood in front of Pickett and Dunnett in the cold November morning with her breath coming in little clouds, and she said her piece. The same words she'd said to Dunnett, shaped a little tighter, and at the end she said, "I am here by my own choice. I will stay by my own choice. If you want to know my choice more clearly, you are welcome to bring me before a judge, in which case I will say everything I've just said again, in front of as many people as you like. And I'll also talk about the conditions I was found in, and who found me, and who has kept me safe since then." Pickett stared at her. She stared back. She had that set to her jaw, the one I'd started to recognize, the particular firmness of a woman who has been underestimated so long and so completely that she no longer feels the need to argue about it. She just does the thing and lets the result explain itself. Pickett looked at me. I didn't say anything. He looked at Dunnett. Dunnett looked at his boots. They left. Clara watched them go. Her arms were crossed at her waist, and after their horses rounded the bend, she let out a long breath that was all the feeling she'd been holding in while they were there, and then she turned and looked at me. She said, "I was scared." I said, "I know." She said, "I didn't want to show it." I said, "You didn't." She said, "Were you scared?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "I was concerned. It's a different thing. Scared moves fast and burns out. Concerned stays and works." She looked at me with those steady green eyes. She said, "That's a good way to put it." She went back inside. I stood in the cold for a moment, and I was aware that my people had been watching all of it, all 20-some of them, from various positions around the camp, and that nobody was pretending they hadn't been. Winona caught my eye from across the way, and she gave me the particular look she'd been giving me since we were children, the look that meant, "Well, and what did you expect?" I didn't have an answer for that. The winter came early and hard. We moved the camp closer to the main settlement in early November because the weather was going to require it and because I needed to be with my people in full. Clara came with us. She came without discussion, without my having to ask. She was part of the moving, hauling, packing, the way she'd made herself part of every practical thing that happened around her. She was learning Lakota. Not from being taught exactly, she absorbed it, the way a person absorbs a language they are surrounded by and are paying attention to. She had started with words for things: water, fire, horse, cold. Then phrases. Then, by December, whole exchanges with Winona's daughter, who was 12 and had decided Clara was the most interesting person who'd arrived in her life, which Clara seemed quietly and carefully delighted by. My daughter, her name was Sakala, which means little one, which she'd been called since before she was born and had not yet outgrown, though she was 8 now and working on it. My daughter was less sure about Clara at first. Sakala was a cautious child, careful about new things, which she came by honestly. She observed Clara from distances for about 2 weeks, like a hawk working out the exact nature of a thing on the ground below. Then one morning I came out of my lodge and found Sakala teaching Clara to make the particular knot used for hanging meat bags. This was Sakala's knot. She'd invented it herself, or anyway she believed she had, which amounted to the same thing. She was teaching it to Clara with the serious, slightly impatient energy of an 8-year-old, who considers herself an expert. Clara was learning the knot with both hands and her full attention, making the mistakes she was supposed to make so the correction meant something. I stood for a moment and watched. My wife, Sakala's mother, had died 4 winters past. Her name was Mapia, which means cloud. She died of a fever that took her in 3 days, which was the kind of thing that happened on the reservation when there was no doctor for 50 miles, and the agent's response to a request for one was to write something in a book and say he'd see what could be done. I had been angry about it for a long time. I was still angry about it in the way that settles into a man's bones and becomes part of how he stands. I hadn't thought about the shape of what was missing until I stood there watching Clara learn a knot from my daughter. Sakala said something and Clara laughed, that short, surprised sound, and Sakala laughed too, and I turned away and went to see about the horses. It was January when I finally said the thing that had been building since October. We were the only ones awake. I'd gotten up before dawn to check on a mare that had been off her feed, and Clara had gotten up because she rarely slept past the very first lightening of the sky. That habit had not left her, the needing to watch the darkness thin, the making sure. We'd met at the fire without planning to, both of us with our cups, and we'd been sitting there for a while in the particular silence of 2 people who are comfortable enough with each other that silence isn't something to manage. I said, "What do you want, after this?" She looked at me over her cup, "After this." I said, "When spring comes, when you've had time to think about what's next." She was quiet for a while, the fire shifted. She said, "I don't know how to want what isn't in front of me." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I mean that wanting things that weren't in front of me in that place, it didn't help. It made the days longer, so I stopped doing it. I learned to want only what was immediately possible." She paused. "Water, warmth. The hour when I could go outside and work, small things." I said, "And now?" She looked at the fire. She said, "Now I'm learning to look further than that." A pause. "It's strange. It's like a muscle that hasn't been used." I said, "What do you see when you look further?" She looked at me then, directly, in that level way she had. She said, "I see here. I see your daughter showing me a knot. I see Winona arguing with Magpie about the right way to smoke meat, which, from what I can tell, they have been arguing about for 40 years. I see the sky every morning." A pause. "I see you." The fire made a small sound. I said, "Clara." She said, "I know what I am. I know I came out of a hole in the ground with nothing. I know I don't have anything to—" She stopped, started again. "I am not saying this as a way of asking for something. I am saying it because you asked, and because you have been honest with me since the first moment, and I would rather be honest back than—" She stopped again. I said, "I know what you were going to say." She said, "Do you?" I said, "You were going to say you have nothing to offer." She looked at me. I said, "That is a thing that was put in you by Herschel Grubb and whoever came before him. It is not a fact. It is a kind of damage." She held very still. I said, "What you have, what you are, is more than most people I have known. You walked out of 13 years of darkness, and within 3 weeks you were standing in front of a sheriff telling him what you chose. You learned a new language with your hands before you learned it with your mouth. My daughter does not trust people quickly, and she trusts you." I paused. I was not a man who said many words when fewer would do, but this required the full count. And I have not felt present in my own life since Mapia died, not until you were in it. The fire. The dark edge of the sky beginning to go from black to the particular gray that comes before anything else. Clara set her cup down carefully. She was looking at her hands, then she looked up. She said, "I don't know how to do this. I should tell you that." I said, "Neither do I." She said, "You've been married before." I said I was, and I still don't know how to do this. I know how to do it wrong in all the same ways. That doesn't help. Something moved across her face. That almost smile, and this time it became the real thing, slow, a little uncertain, and in it more courage than most people show in a year. She said, "I wake up every morning and make sure the sky is there." I said, "I know." She said, "I don't think I'm going to stop needing to do that." I said, "You don't have to stop." She reached out and put her hand on my arm. Not reaching, not grasping, just setting her hand there, with the flat, deliberate warmth of someone who has decided. I put my hand over hers, and her fingers were cold from the cup, and I held them until they weren't. We sat there as the sky went from gray to the first thin, cold color of dawn, and neither of us said anything more for a while, and the fire burned down, and the camp began to stir, and somewhere a horse stamped and blew in the cold. Spring came late that year, still cold in April, the ground reluctant. Dunnett had made one more attempt, in February, writing to the agent Collier, and suggesting that the situation at my settlement was irregular and worth looking into. Collier wrote back something that I was told amounted to, "The chief is not someone I want to aggravate unnecessarily at this time." I was never sure whether Collier said it out of any sense of what was right or simply because he was tired, and the situation was too complicated to be worth it. I chose to accept it as the gift it was, from wherever it came. Pickett had come once more, alone this time in March. He had ridden up to the edge of the camp and sat his horse and looked at me, and I had looked back at him, and after a moment he'd said he just wanted to be sure the woman was well. I had said she was. He had looked past me at the camp, at the normal industry of a settlement at the end of a hard winter, the women and the men and the children, everything in motion, and then he'd looked back at me and nodded once and ridden away. I never understood Pickett entirely. Maybe no one did. Clara found me after he rode away. She'd seen him come and go. She said, "Is it over?" I said, "I think so, for now." She said, "For now." I said, "That's what I can offer. I have never been able to offer more than for now. The world keeps making new problems." She said, "I know." She put her arm through mine. She'd been doing that lately, the easy, comfortable claim of it, that particular way a woman takes a man's arm when she's decided he's hers to take, and she looked out at the hills where the last of the snow was going. She said, "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" I said, "What?" She said, "That padlock, that rusted-through padlock." A pause. "I thought about it before I came up. I heard you hit it 3 times. And I thought, what kind of man bothers with 3 strikes on a lock when he could just ride on? When he has no reason to stop?" I said, "A man who pays attention to locks." She said, "A man who pays attention." She leaned against my arm, her shoulder against mine, and I felt her weight there. Not heavy, just present. The solid, particular weight of a person who is where they've decided to be. And we stood like that as the spring that was still mostly winter moved across the hills. My daughter came out of Winona's lodge behind us and made a sound designed to communicate that we were being embarrassing, and Clara turned and said something to her in Lakota, accented, slightly wrong in the verb form, but understandable, and Sakala made the sound again and came to stand on my other side, and the 3 of us stood there looking out at the hills. I am 53 now as I tell this. That is 2 years gone. Clara and I were married that spring in the way of my people, and the following fall in the way of hers. She had wanted both, she said, Not because she was caught between two worlds, but because both were hers, and she would not be told otherwise. Sakala stood next to her both times with the expression of someone who would prefer you not notice how pleased they were, which was something she also came by honestly. The agent Collier retired, and the new agent was a younger man who was not exactly good but was less interested in being bad, which in that world was a reasonable improvement. My 3 young men who'd been in Pickett's jail are still with us. The eldest of them, whose name is High Hawk, has a daughter now. She is just past a year old, and she is enormously sure of herself, and this appears to be a permanent condition. There are still hard things. There will always be hard things. The reservation is still too small. The winters are still too cold. The men in offices with their letters and their books have not stopped being men in offices with their letters and their books. I'm not the kind of man to tell you that love solves any of that. It doesn't. The world's weight doesn't change because you're not carrying it alone. It's the same weight. What changes is the carrying. Clara still wakes before dawn. Every morning. Every single morning she gets up in the dark and she goes outside and she watches the sky. Sometimes I go with her. Sometimes I watch her through the lodge door, the set of her shoulders, the way she tilts her head back, and the breath she lets out when the light comes. She told me once that she didn't think she'd ever stop needing to make sure. I told her she didn't have to stop. She said, "You keep saying that." I said, "It keeps being true." She turned around and looked at me standing in the doorway, and the dawn light was coming up behind her and making her difficult to see directly, the way the dawn does, and she said in Lakota, her Lakota now, not accented anymore, not slightly wrong, just hers, she said, "You are a man who opens doors." I said in English, because sometimes a thing fits one language better than another. I had a good reason to. She came back inside out of the cold, and she walked past Sakala's sleeping place and touched her daughter's hair lightly as she passed, and she came to where I was, and she put both her hands on the sides of my face, and she held them there, and she looked at me the way she had been looking at me since that November morning in front of Pickett and done it, like a verdict, carefully considered, final. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Outside the sky was as big and as old as it has always been, and the cold was the particular clean cold of early spring, and somewhere in the camp a horse shifted and stamped, and I stood there with her hands on my face and her eyes on mine, and I was, for the first time in a long time, entirely where I was. That is all I have to tell you. That is enough.